All right, so thank you all again for joining us. Our speaker today is a historian of the Second World War with a specialization in the Soviet Union's Red Army. His research for his first book explored the Red Army's encounter with Romania, Bulgaria, Yugoslavia, Hungary, and Austria during the last year of the war, with a focus on explaining Soviet-perpetrated sexual violence. For his second book, he will look at how the Soviet armed forces responded to the Holocaust across the Eastern Front. He is an assistant professor of history at the University of North Texas and the deputy director of the Military History Center. I welcome Dr. Vojin Majstorovic.
Well, thank you all for coming. Thank you for the generous introduction. Haley Stewart was one of the first people I met when I came to Metroplex area back in 2019 as part of my interview process. So very pleasant memories. Thank you to Dr. Wisley for inviting me. And I'm very happy to be at Tarrant County College. Okay, so first part of the presentation, I'll talk about my research on the Soviet Union Red Army's occupation of several countries in Eastern Europe with the focus on the issue of sexual violence. It's not the only thing I research. It's one of the issues that come up during the research on occupation, but that will be the focus of what I'll talk about today. And then in the second part, hopefully we can have a nice question and answer session. The title of my talk today is The Red Army Storms into Europe, Combat, Hatred, and Vengeance on the Eastern Front. So these are all the themes that I'll develop over the next 40 minutes or so. In the first part, I'll give a brief background on the Soviet-German War, the Eastern Front. And in the second part, I'll focus more specifically on the occupation of several countries in the Balkans and Central Europe by the Red Army in the last year of the war. Okay, so first, the background. Eastern Front and the Soviet-German War was its largest area of operations in the war, where most soldiers fought, and in many ways it was the decisive theater of the war. Nazis, since they came to power in 1933, always viewed Soviet Union as their primary enemy. Central to Hitler's ideology was the idea of Lebensraum, or living space. So Hitler looked at American history. Hitler didn't know much history, but he had very superficial knowledge. He read a few things here and there and then picked up and developed these whole theories. And he came to the conclusion that the United States became a powerful country because it managed to expand from 13 colonies along the Atlantic coast. They spread across the continent, and they became a powerful country. He also admired Great Britain in that they had this great empire. They could draw on resources from all over the world. And he looked at Germany, a relatively small landlocked country in Europe, and he thought that the only way Germany could reach its full potential is if they would find their living space, Lebensraum. And this living space was to be in Eastern Europe. Germany, you may have heard this idea of Hitler believing in a 1,000-year Third Reich, an empire that would last 1,000 millennium. He was referring to the creation of this great state from what's Germany today. They would conquer all of Poland, all of Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, and create this empire. The people in those territories, all of the Jews, this is the homeland of traditional Ashkenazi European Jews, right? They would have to be killed. Millions of Russians, Ukrainians, Belarusians would have to be starved or killed, and eventually German settlers would settle there, and this would all become part of the German Empire. And so this was the ideology and the background to the war. More practically, the decision to invade Soviet Union in 1941 came as a result of a problem, strategic problem the Germans had. They conquered France, they defeated Low Countries, but Great Britain was still in the war. And they had no way of getting to Great Britain because Germany didn't have a navy. And so Hitler thought if we would invade Soviet Union, have a quick victory, we'll have all of these resources, the food resources, the oil, the metals, and everything that Germany would need for a long-term war against Great Britain and potentially United States. Soviet Union was also always preparing for war. Since the Communist Revolution in 1917, Soviet leaders believed that they would have to fight a war with the capitalist West. At first, they thought the war would be with Great Britain, but then after 1933, after Hitler came to power, they came to a conclusion that the war would be not with Britain, but with Germany. And so even though the Soviet government had been readying for war in general since they came to power and they've built a strong army, they were still caught by surprise when the invasion happened on June 22nd, 1941. 1941, and to a lesser extent 1942, were years of enormous tactical and operational success for Germans. They managed, these are all the Soviet territories that they captured in those first 2 years, but even though they managed to capture all of these territories, even though they destroyed, encircled and destroyed millions of Soviet soldiers, they did not have strategic success. The whole point of the German invasion was fall of the Soviet government and that they would capture all of these territories in European part of Soviet Union. However, the Soviet Union kept on fighting. They could create new armies. They had vast reserves, and Germans were caught in a war of attrition, which they absolutely could not afford to engage in. But just to sort of put into perspective how tactically successful and operationally the Germans were, in 1941, the first year of the war, they destroyed 70% of the Red Army. So 70% of all of the Soviet soldiers' equipment that they had, they lost in the first 6 months of 1941. In 1942, they lost another 40%. They kept on building more and regenerating their armies. The Soviet-German war was extraordinarily brutal. The Germans planned to destroy the Soviet state and the vast majority of its population, and they acted accordingly. Hitler called it the war of annihilation. They had a policy called the Hunger Plan, where they planned on starving to death 30 million civilians in all of the major cities, in Moscow, Leningrad, Kiev, Kharkov, all of these large industrial centers, because Nazi thinking was, well, we don't need urban residents in these territories. We could keep some farmers so that it would work the lands, but the cities would starve. And these are the Soviet wartime losses. 26.6 million people killed during the war. And now there's a debate amongst historians what percentage exactly were military losses, right? So military losses are 11.3 to 14.6, but however you put it, these are the civilian casualties. It exceeds by far any other theater of war. The German occupation was extremely brutal. It was in line with this idea of Germans conquering, Nazis conquering, let's not blame, well, okay, Nazis, the living space. We're just beginning to find out about the system of sexual slavery that Germans instituted in the East. There's few scholars researching this. I'll say a few things simply because I'm going to talk about Soviets doing it, and Germans started the war and they instituted their own system. So what's emerging from these researchers now is that Germans basically had a system very similar to the much better known Japanese system of the so-called comfort woman. They created brothels in the Soviet Union, which were operated by Wehrmacht, the regular German army. And most of the girls and women in these brothels were actually kidnapped or in some way forced into these positions. As the war continued, in winter of 42-43, Soviets stopped Germans at Stalingrad, and then slowly they push back against German conquests in Soviet Union. And the question is, why didn't the Soviet Union collapse in these first year and a half, of 1941 and 1942, when they lost so many territories? And there's many answers to these questions, many sort of perspectives. One is that at the beginning of the war, Wehrmacht had considerable combat experience. They had fought in Poland, in Western Europe, in Scandinavia, in the Balkans, and in sharp conscience, the Red Army had very limited war experience. The Red Army leadership and morale was crippled by the Great Purges of 1937, 1938, when most of the leading generals were accused of being spies and executed. But in early stages of the war, Stalin relaxed, they never stopped. They relaxed repressions against the officers, and they allowed a younger generation of talented officers to emerge. So that's one aspect. And Stalin began listening to military advice in 1942. So in 1941, Stalin was the one who was always in charge. In 1942, the Soviet dictator, he's still in charge, but he takes the advice of his commanders. But what I want to talk about briefly is that hundreds of thousands of soldiers and junior commanders in this war of annihilation, as Hitler called it, they were promoted and sent after a very quick training to front lines. These young men were usually from the cities. They were in their early 20s, or even they were in their late teens, which means they grew up under the Soviet system. They were sympathetic to the Soviet system, and they were often members of the communist youth movement or the Communist Party. They didn't have lots of proper academic training simply because the standard military academies during the war, they shortened their courses from few years to few months. But what they lacked in formal military training, they compensated in almost reckless courage, commitment to victory, and absolute hatred of the enemy. And over the years of the war, they accumulated vast combat experience. Most importantly, occupying mid-level officer positions throughout the army, they were the glue which held the rank and file together with the highest military leadership. The casualties in the Red Army were always so high that an average infantryman did not last longer than a few months at most. So this constant turnover of military personnel required these mid-level officers were the ones who took in new recruits, trained them, they passed on some of the experience, which made the Red Army more military capable. And so an example of one of these young people who was promoted to an officer at an early age after most of the officer corps was wiped out in 41, 42 is Captain Pyotr Mikhin. He wrote a book which has been translated to English, memoir, Guns Against the Reich. He was an artillery officer. He volunteered for the front, but he was a student of mathematics. And because he was a good mathematician, he was sent to artillery because, well, they could calculate where they needed to hit the Germans. By the end of the war, he rose to the rank of captain, and he commanded an artillery battalion. In the 3 years that it took the Red Army to expel the Germans and their allies from the Soviet Union, according to his count, he was wounded 3 times and had 29 close brushes with death, that's according to his count. He fought at Stalingrad, he fought at Kursk, the battles that decided the outcome of the war on the Eastern Front. He destroyed countless German tanks, guns, and soldiers. And so and then he fought in the siege of Budapest in Austria, and that's where he ended the war. So ultimately, the Soviet army learned how to fight at different levels, from staff officers to generals in the field to the rank and file. And although the Red Army had a very high casualty rate, higher than Germans overall, they also inflicted devastating losses on the Axis. During the war, the Red Army killed, injured, or captured almost 11 million German soldiers, which represented 80% of all German casualties. So 80% of all Germans who were killed in the war or captured or injured, they would suffer those losses on the Eastern Front against the Red Army. In addition, the Red Army also killed, injured, or captured 1,700,000 German allied troops, including Romanians, the Finns, few Hungarians, Slovaks, and so on. And so it's not an exaggeration to suggest that the Red Army broke Wehrmacht's back on the Eastern Front. I think even historians who argue that we should not overestimate the importance of destroying infantry divisions in the East, they would agree with this conclusion that it's sort of the Red Army that breaks Wehrmacht's back. And so this is kind of the background information to what I'll talk about, the scope of the war, and hopefully it contextualizes what I'll talk about now more specifically, the Soviet occupation of these countries. So this is my research is on 3rd and 2nd Ukrainian fronts. They fought in the very southern end of the Soviet-German front line. These are the front lines in the summer of 1944, just when they managed to enter, to leave Soviet territories and to enter Europe. The 2nd Ukrainian front was previously known as the Steppe Front, and it fought at Kursk in July of 1943, and it advanced into Ukraine from central Russia. The Southwestern Front, the future 3rd Ukrainian Front, fought around Stalingrad and advanced into Ukraine from southern Russia as well. In October of 1943, they were renamed 2nd and 3rd Ukrainian Fronts. The fronts army groups. In the Soviet jargon, front is an army group, received their names from their geographical locations. The two army groups operated in what is today considered to be eastern and southern Ukraine, liberating major cities such as Kharkiv, Donetsk, Dnipropetrovsk, and Odessa. And eventually they entered the Republic of Moldova on the border with Romania in the south, and then into the Balkans. If anybody follows what's happening in Ukraine today, all of these cities are sort of in the news today in very different circumstances. And I cannot ignore that fact. I wrote most of this research before the Syrian war started, and whenever I read this, I come back to it. But the Soviet military carried wholesale mobilization in the field. So the way the mobilization worked is that the Red Army created, they called them reserve regiments. They were basically quick courses for men found locally, so that they wouldn't have to send them to the official training centers into the country's interior. Army had its own training facilities on the go. As you can imagine, these weren't sort of very thorough. They weren't very good. They weren't very detailed. The main idea is, because of the high casualty rates, we need to get the local soldiers as soon as possible into the fighting ranks. By the summer of 1944, when the Red Army entered Romania, which is sort of my main area of research, the two army groups tended to be mostly made up of Ukrainians. But it's not only that up to 2/3 of soldiers were Ukrainian, many officers were also Ukrainian. So for instance, Marshal Malinovsky, the commander of 2nd Ukrainian Front, he was from Odessa, he was a Ukrainian. Two more army commanders in these two army groups were from Ukraine, and many more high-ranking officers. I will not. Most significantly, another marshal, Marshal Timoshenko, he wasn't on the front lines. He worked in a staff as one of Stalin's main advisors, and his job was to coordinate the activities of Soviet armies in the south on behalf of the Soviet Supreme Command. He was also Ukrainian. And so, since so many of these soldiers were Ukrainian, it's worth saying a few things about their national identity and how they view themselves at this time. Historians historian Karel Berkov, he studied identity in central Ukraine during the war. He argued that most Ukrainians viewed themselves as separate from Russians, but also part of the larger Russian sort of family of nations. And so he concluded that the majority of people in these parts of Ukraine, not everywhere, thought of Ukrainians as a subgroup of Russians, at once separate, but also part of this larger whole. And my research, I agree with this. I find that the Ukrainian soldiers tended to view themselves as both Ukrainians and Soviet at the same time, and that for most of them, these two weren't in contradiction. So after clearing Soviet territories in August 44, the Second and Third Ukrainian fronts fought. These are the countries that I'm examining. This is Romania, Bulgaria, Yugoslavia, Hungary, and Austria. The war continued exacting a heavy toll as the fighting continued. We really don't know much about the Red Army activities in these countries. What we do know is about the Red Army activities in Germany and Berlin. There are several books about this. This has become part of widespread knowledge, sort of the sexual violence that Soviet soldiers committed on their march to Berlin. In the Cold War, this was very important sort of piece of information and propaganda. Well, it's actually true, it wasn't propaganda, but this was used to organize Western Europe against the Soviet threat. But we know very little about these other countries, which weren't as important to the history of the Cold War as Germany. And so what I found in my research is that the soldiers and officers from these two army groups, Second and Third Ukrainian fronts, they wreaked havoc against civilian populations in enemy countries, those countries that were allied with Germany. And that includes Romania, Hungary, and Austria. Austria was actually part of Germany, part of Third Reich during the war. In contrast, the same troops from the Second and Third Ukrainian fronts behaved with more restraint in neutral Bulgaria and allied Yugoslavia. So Bulgaria actually was allied with Germany, but they never declared war on the Soviet Union. So it was neutral in relationship with the Soviet-German war. And Yugoslavia was part of the Allies, and it was occupied by Germany during the war, but it had a very strong communist resistance movement. And so it can be estimated that the same soldiers raped hundreds of thousands of women in each enemy country, in Romania, Hungary, and Austria, hundreds of thousands. But in Bulgaria and Yugoslavia, they victimized up to maybe 20,000 women, depends on which figures we use. But so it's widespread sexual violence everywhere, but it's more pronounced in these enemy countries. It's important to note that the numbers and estimates that I mentioned, again, they're very rough estimates, they're far from precise. As such, they offer a mere glimpse into overall Soviet conduct. But I think they're useful at revealing the pattern of Soviet soldiers' behavior. Furthermore, these figures refer to rapes, whereas there were many more victims of sexual violence, which is a broader category, which includes victims of harassment, sexual torture, sexual humiliation, forced prostitution, and forced pregnancy. Official documents from the 1940s almost never take into account these broader sexual violence victims. They only refer to rape victims. So there's no doubt that the actual number of victims of Soviet sexual violence was much higher than the number of rape victims. And I understand that each of these victims deserves to have their stories heard, and that if anything, these figures greatly underestimate the number of victims. Although my focus in this presentation is on the perpetrators, it's on the Soviet military, sort of why they commit these atrocities, how does the leadership react, what kind of propaganda they're getting from Moscow about this. I want to explain with a story why an absolute minority of all sexual crimes were ever reported, and to illuminate victims' perspective. So this is Palotine Kali. She's from the village of Barac in Hungary, and she described her family's horrific experiences with Soviet troops in a documentary film that came out in 2013. It's called Silenced Shame. It's available on YouTube. A group of Soviet troops, at least one of whom was an officer, took her mother from the house. When her mother came back, Gabi, then 13-year-old at the time, she could not understand why her mother was bloodied, had her clothes torn, and why the Soviet soldiers would have beaten her up. Gabi's mother was obviously raped, but they never talked about it in the family. So the first time she ever mentioned this incident was when this film was made decades after the event. She also described another incident. She said that it's very hard and still she doesn't understand what happened. A group of Soviet soldiers' motorbike broke down next to their house. They stopped to eat and drink. After the officer finished his supper, he began to harass Gabi, who again at this time was a child. She was 13 years old. And she described herself as nothing more than a skinny child at this time. Her grandma pulled Gabi away and took the soldier to the bedroom to Gabi's mother, who was recovering from the previous act of sexual violence. So while the mother was in the bedroom, the grandma took the rosary in her hands and they held Gabi closed and they prayed while the soldiers raped her mother and the grandmother's daughter. So effectively, grandma sacrificed her daughter to protect granddaughter. This is not an unusual instant sort of dynamic in these circumstances, and it comes up in other sources as well. So the sexual assaults by Soviet officers obviously represented a lifelong trauma for Gabi and her family, in which older women did what they could to protect the youngest. Based on the Gabi's descriptions of sexual assaults, it's inconceivable that they would ever report this incident at the time to either the Soviet officers who were theoretically responsible for controlling their troops, or to Hungarian police who would have been even in less of a position to do anything because they were being occupied. And so I think this story illustrates vividly both how the victims lived through this occupation, and it's not only in Hungary, and it's really not only under the Soviet occupation, it happens in a lot of other places as well, but why those reported figures are so greatly underestimated. If the victims could not even speak to themselves about these horrific incidents, then they were even less likely to report it to authorities. Okay. So, moving on. About 1 million women served in the Red Army. What distinguished Soviet women in the Red Army from other militaries which did have many women is that women served in combat roles. So out of 34 million 34 million Soviet citizens served in the Red Army during the war in various capacities, 1 million of them were women. Women were mostly volunteers. They weren't conscripted, which means that those who were in the Red Army were there because of their own choice, either because of patriotic reasons, because maybe there were desperate circumstances at home, there was a widespread famine even in unoccupied territories during the war. Being in the military was a sure way to at least get some basic food. But they were volunteers by definition. But even though they served in large numbers, and this is really interesting, it's a separate history, but the Soviet policies towards women were very contradictory and, okay, well, that's a different story. But if you are interested, I would suggest you can pursue this as a study. Although women served in large numbers, they faced a very hostile environment amongst their male comrades and officers. At best, they would have to overcome widespread attitudes among officers who wanted to protect women from frontline service. So, for instance, Lieutenant Stanislava Petrovna Volkova, she was university educated, and she finished a specialized officer course for sappers. When Volkova arrived to the headquarters at the front, she was assigned clerical duties to Marshal Malinovsky, the commander of the Second Ukrainian Front. And she vehemently protested at this idea that she has university training, she had military training, and that she would be assigned to clerical duties. She argued with Malinovsky, and he told her, fine, you can go and serve, but you should know that the average sapper commander doesn't last more than 2 months at best. And she said, fine. She did survive the war, but she was wounded. So this is sort of that paternalistic desire to protect women. This was extremely widespread. But there was also many soldiers and officers were predatory towards their female comrades and subordinates. The Red Army had a subculture which wasn't unusual for a wartime military culture, which prized sexual conquest and combat as sort of main virtues. An important part of the male soldier's identity was their ability to have intercourse and then to brag about that intercourse with others. And for male soldiers, practically all women, even those girls who fought against the Germans, remain girls. In the Russian language, there's a difference between girls and young women, and one is used for, the latter is used for more sort of ambitious women, and girls is used for women who are supposedly less ambitious. And so it doesn't make much sense in English language, but in Russian it actually does, because by calling them girls, they're always returning them to this position of subordination, sexual subordination to men. So for instance, one male soldier wrote in a letter that I found in archive, he wrote, in the army, they regard women like gramophone records. You play it, and then you throw it away. Many male soldiers did not view the Red Army women primarily as comrades, but as one historian has argued, as sex objects in uniforms. Although many soldiers were interested in pursuing sexual relations with women, only officers tended to be able to find mistresses in the military. There were simply too many men and too few women. And more critically, only officers held the power to pressure and reward service women for sexual relations. This culture in the Red Army made it almost impossible for women to serve in mixed gender units. Initially, the idea was that units would be integrated, but the sexual harassment was so widespread that very quickly even Stalin backed down, and by and large, women served in all women units. So they would have an all women sniper platoon, they had women fighter or bomber squadrons, but there were exceptions, and there were actually integrated units. One woman sniper in an all-woman woman sniper in an all-woman sniper squadron told her male commander during the Battle of Stalingrad, "We are here in the army to fight, but officers view us as if we're ladies or girls. We are not girls. All of us have higher or incomplete higher education, but they approach us with dubious proposals. It's impossible to get rid of them." And then she went on to compare them to flies. Although some women entered into relations with officers voluntarily, many were compelled by circumstances. So for instance, one general was forced servicewomen to attend parties with male officers, punishing them if they refused. Occasionally, Soviet officers were held criminally responsible and punished for this type of coercion, but this happened relatively rarely. There's an incredible book by Belarusian Nobel winning author Svetlana Alexievich, and it's called The Unwomanly Face of War. So it's a bunch of interviews she did with women soldiers, but she did those interviews in 70s and 80s. So before the rise of modern Western sort of type feminism, And it's really an incredible source. It was published initially in Russian. She couldn't publish it during the Soviet period. It was published in the early 90s, and it was translated into English. And this book is one of the reasons she won the Nobel Prize. I always assign it to my graduate students. It's a really incredible book full of these stories told by woman to woman. So if Soviet women fighting side by side with Soviet soldiers had a difficult time of being accepted and integrated into the military, then when the Red Army enters Europe and they have these civilians from countries who have attacked the Soviet Union, or that Soviet soldiers view themselves as justified in sort of for hating them or wishing this punishment, you can see how those dynamics, how it would escalate. Okay, so now I'll talk about the leadership and what is the Soviet command system, its role in the sexual violence, and it's complicated. To understand the variation in the Soviet soldiers' conduct, I will talk about the high command, which sent mixed signals to the rank and file about the acceptability of violence against civilians. The Red Army's propaganda apparatus was impressive. They had an institution called political department. It was subordinate to the commander. And in every unit, they had political officers all the way down to the sort of the smallest unit in the foxhole. And these political officers were responsible for morale, for spreading communist ideology, and also selling to the troops the narrative that Moscow at the time wanted them to accept. And the Red Army developed something they called hate propaganda. And the main purpose of the hate propaganda was to motivate the troops to fight by inciting hate against the Germans and calling on the troops to exact revenge for Nazi atrocities against Soviet prisoners of war or civilians. And there is no shortage of Nazi atrocities against Soviet POWs or civilians. Much of propaganda was delivered in lectures, while newspapers and leaflets were also distributed regularly. So this is one rather typical Soviet military poster, and inciting Soviet soldiers to resist and motivating them to fight by depicting German soldier as this woman has been clearly, she's been murdered, violated, she's partially naked. So Soviet propaganda relentlessly depicts German soldiers, not inaccurately to be fair, but as sort of these gang of marauding and raping and pillaging criminals. There's also what I call interactive propaganda, which encouraged the frontline troops to participate in the political theater of hate. One method of this interactive propaganda were mass demonstrations. Sometimes the Red Army called them meetings of revenge. At these events, soldiers would read letters from home which informed them about the Axis atrocities or liberated prisoners of war and civilians related the horrors of Nazi occupation. The tone of the language at the meetings of revenge was always righteous anger, while the speakers appealed to Soviet troops' most bloodthirsty urges. After one meeting revenge, in a report that I found in the Russian State Military Archive, a regimental commander of the 3rd Ukrainian Front reported that soldiers recited a collective oath. And so you have all of the soldiers of the regiment, sort of they gather and they swear a collective oath. And the oath stated, we will exact revenge against the German conquerors for all the villainy and criminal acts that they committed against the citizens of our Soviet country. We are propelled westwards by our burning hatred for you, Hitlerland. We will force you, fascist Germany, to wash out with your tears the world which had been drenched in blood of millions murdered and buried alive citizens of our fatherland. And so this is the example of the Soviet hate propaganda. Some army newspapers ran essay contests on the topics such as why I want to kill every German. And then soldiers would write letters, essays, why I want to kill every German. And the most bloodthirsty and the most persuasive essay would win awards. Given such tone of official discourse and propaganda, it's unsurprising that some Soviet soldiers felt that they were acting in the spirit of orders when they committed various atrocities. However, it's interesting that in countries that did not fight against Soviet Union, in Bulgaria and Yugoslavia, the propaganda was very different. Propaganda encouraged soldiers to have positive views of these countries. So both Bulgaria and Serbian part of Yugoslavia, where the Red Army moved through, these are details but important, they're Slavic-speaking countries, so they speak language which is related to Russian, distinct but kind of similar, sort of like Spanish and French, let's say. And they're also Orthodox Christian. So in these countries, because they did not fight against the Soviet Union, the high command, the propaganda was very much positive about these countries. So for instance, one high-ranking political officer in the Third Ukrainian Front, this group of officers responsible for propaganda, he recalled in his memoirs after the war, before Bulgaria, we discussed cultivating hatred among Soviet troops for the German fascist conquerors. And this German fascist conquerors, this is very much Soviet jargon. But now we talked only about the friendship of the Bulgarian and Russian people. So I think this story is indicative of just how far the Soviet leadership went to encourage these positive views of Bulgarians and Serbs. Central to the Soviet leadership's efforts to create a pro-Bulgarian atmosphere, Russia played an important role in the 19th century of liberating Bulgaria from the Ottoman Empire, not because Russia is generous, but because Ottoman Empire was the traditional nemesis of the Russian Empire. So whatever. But the Bulgarians then built all of these churches and monuments on behalf of Russian soldiers. And the main cathedral is called the Nevsky Cathedral in the capital of Bulgaria, Sofia. And so the Soviet army would take Soviet soldiers to these sites, right, to these monuments and churches, and they would say, look, Bulgarians built this in honor of Russia, and now you have to behave correctly towards the civilians so not to dishonor their memory. A special NKVD team was tasked with collecting information on how to be polite in Bulgaria. What are the table manners? How should you greet a man of the house? How you should greet a woman of the house? What's the etiquette of eating properly? And they distributed this document to other officers so that they would behave. I can't imagine anybody really paid attention to this, but it speaks of the efforts of the leadership in this area to sort of try to minimize the violence. But even in enemy countries, the Soviet leadership went to considerable lengths to prevent the outbreaks of mass rapes, especially when they threatened morale and cohesion of fighting armies. The problem is that military tribunal records, it's this institution which punished soldiers in the Red Army, nobody can get to it. Not even Russian historians who have access to the Ministry of Defense archive can get there. But based on what has been published, we know that over 10,000 soldiers and officers were prosecuted by the Soviet military justice, I can't call it justice, but Soviet military courts for committing acts of violence against civilians in 1945, and a large number in 1944. The usual penalty for convicted soldiers is, well, they would be sentenced to death usually, but then the commander would commute this sentence and send a soldier to a so-called penal battalion where they were supposed to, and I quote, wash away their sins with blood. The idea is that they have to fight for 3 months in this battalion, which is deployed in the most dangerous sector of the front, and if they survive, they could be reinstated in the regular military, regular army. But surviving those was sort of a tall order, especially during the periods of heavy fighting. But I found dozens of orders from the commanders of 2nd Ukrainian Front, 3rd Ukrainian Front, forbidding acts of sexual violence. So for instance, Marshal Malinovsky, commander of the Second Ukrainian Front, I'll quote just one order. Soon after his troops entered Hungary, he issued an order in which he declared that he was continuing to receive reports about the cases of pillaging and raping of women. He instructed prosecutors to urgently investigate all instances of reported rapes and to punish the culprits as well as their commanders who tolerated it. As a further deterrent, Malinovsky ordered prosecutors to inform families and communities of the executed criminals of their fate. So if a soldier was punished for these crimes, then the military prosecutor needed to send a letter to his family, to his friends, to the local mayor, saying this soldier did not die a hero, he died as an enemy of the motherland. And that's how actually the rapists were viewed, as not as criminals, but as traitors of the cause. And so these orders were issued regularly, which clearly indicates that they were not being implemented. And it's difficult to say at which level of command this implementation breaks down. I argue that it's at the very bottom. It's the frontline soldiers. We'll get to this quickly. I have like 5 minutes, okay. And so ultimately, the violence originates amongst the frontline troops, right? It's not. Well, you would, if this would work, you would see Major Boris Slutsky, a frontline officer. Thank you so much. So Major Boris Slutsky recorded how he and other Soviet soldiers reacted to encountering the first major European city in his mixture of diary and a memoir. Right? He wrote this diary during the war, and then, no, it's one back, I think.
One back.
Okay, one forward. One more forward. That's him, okay. And so, thank you. So I clearly that made a mistake, but okay. So this is what he wrote in his memoirs. Suddenly, almost colliding with the Black Sea, Constanta, the city in Romania, appeared in front of us. It almost corresponded to our regular dream of happiness and afterwar. Showers, restaurants, showers, beds with clean bed linen, stores with reptilian merchants and women, elegant urban women, the girls of Europe, the first tribute that we took from the defeated enemy. And in this quote, there's so much. The reptilian merchants, you can clearly see the Soviet anti-capitalist propaganda. Any merchant is obviously reptilian. But Major says that we took women as sort of a legitimate loot. And what you need to know is that Boris Slutsky, he's very honest in his memoirs. He's one of the most intellectual sort of Soviet officers. He belongs more in a Moscow or St. Petersburg literary salon. He has a glorious career as a poet after the war. He becomes one of the most famous Soviet poets and literature specialists. But even he talks about this idea that the soldiers from the bottom, on their own sort of wishes and instincts, committed these acts of violence. So even his determination to extract a tribute from the enemy, it's very impossible to distinguish from the atavistic view of women as legitimate spoils of war that many peasant soldiers also held. So although leadership policies played an important role in shaping of the troops' conduct, ultimately the mass sexual violence was a crime from below. And in order to explain why the Red Army behaved in a certain way, it's necessary to understand their attitudes to women and sex. But to understand the variation in intensity of violence between these enemy countries and allied countries, well, propaganda partially explains it, but it's also about the soldiers' attitudes to each of these nations. So I will talk about the Soviet attitudes to Romanians. Romanians as an example of enemy nation, and Yugoslavia is the example of a friendly country, to see how these views diverged and how they would help us understand the various differences in intensity of violence. The Red Army soldiers knew Romanians well. They fought in large numbers on the Eastern Front. Romania occupied and administered large parts of the Soviet Union, including the parts from where many of the Soviet soldiers from these two front army groups came from. Romania was a neighboring country of the Soviet Union, and Romanian and Russian entanglements throughout history have been extensive. And Soviet soldiers and officers, almost without exception, held Romanians in contempt. They viewed Romanians and they wrote up, okay, well, I'm out of time, a few more minutes and that's it. They viewed the Romanians as an effeminate nation that produced weak soldiers. They viewed them as very venal and corrupt. And you can see that here in this Reptilian Merchants quote by Slutsky. They viewed Romanians as backwards, dirty, and depraved. They made fun of Romanian traditional corn-based diet. They referred to Romanians, and I quote, as gypsies for their perceived darker complexion. And they circulated stories about the supposed sexual aggression of Romanian women. One nickname in Soviet soldiers' jargon for Romanians was the people of the syphilis, because supposedly, this is what Soviet soldiers claim. This is not objectively true. These are their sort of racial stereotypes, because syphilis was so widespread that every doctor, from dentist to ophthalmologist, would be able to treat it. Then Romania switched sides in the war in August of 1944, and that really didn't help. This only confirmed in the Soviet view that the Romanian soldiers are weak and that they can't stand their ground. And then the next country the Red Army goes into is Yugoslavia. And Yugoslavia speaks the language that's related to Russian, the Serbo-Croatian language. Many people share the religion. Yugoslavia was occupied by the Germans, and they have a very strong communist underground movement, which actually comes to power at the time that the Red Army expels the Germans, and they form an alliance. And so the Soviet soldiers developed highly positive views of Yugoslavia and the Yugoslav people, viewing them as hospitable, courageous for resisting Germans, and as family kin. So for instance, one Soviet soldier, Alexander Tverdyshev from the 73rd Guards Division, rank unknown, he wrote a letter to his daughter in Kazakhstan. And he wrote, "I'm in Belgrade, the capital of Yugoslavia, the most wonderful city in which street battles are taking place now. The local Yugoslav partisans, that's the communist fighters, will enter the history of the fatherland war as wonderful knights. If without our help for 3 years they achieved surprising results, with our arrival they're committing wonders. The entire population of the city, young women and men, are fighting in real battle, shoulders to shoulder with us. If God allows me to return home alive, I'll be able to tell you so much about the Yugoslav partisans. They all admire the Red Army, but in turn admire their determination, selflessness, and patriotism." So the widespread view of the Yugoslavs is that they're friendly allies, that they fought against the Nazis as well. They suffered under the Nazis. And this view also goes, it's not only amongst the frontline soldiers, but this is the Guards Lieutenant General Zhdanov. He commanded the 4th Mechanized Corps, the Soviet unit army tank corps which liberated Belgrade. And this is Peko Dapčević, one of the main Yugoslav partisan generals and a veteran of the Spanish Civil War. And so they, after the liberation of the Yugoslav capital, they had this huge ceremony where they would bury the fallen Yugoslav and Soviet soldiers together. They organized a military parade. And so the idea was to encourage the alliance that was developing between these two countries, which, by the way, would completely collapse in 1948. Different story. And so this also helps explain why Soviet soldiers behave with more restraint in Yugoslavia, with some limited more restraint, not completely, obviously. Okay, so I'm out of time. And so thank you very much. I was going to say a few more words about the impact of heavy fighting and combat, which happens in Hungary, making things worse in the Soviet soldiers' behavior, but that's it. Thank you.